So I want to thank you all for joining us for the final panel of the day. You're troopers. I hope you've been having a great time at 1UpState. I know I have. I'm Jamey Stevenson, and very excited to be moderating this panel about page, stage, and screen, exploring connections between writing, performance, and games. We've got 4 esteemed panelists with us who have all kinds of really fascinating intersections between writing work, performance background, filmmaking, poetry, activism, you name it, and games. So I'm going to ask that you each give a little intro for yourself. I know I'm going to toss it over to you. Do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Amanda Stevens. Some of you have seen me talk twice today already. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional in gaming, which means I tell people to not be racist and homophobic and transphobic for a living. It's very great. But on top of that, what most people who know me don't know is that I'm a classically trained musician. I play 3 instruments and am a classically trained tenor. I'm also a poet, and my background also used to be in film production. So I do a lot of very different things, and now arts is more of a hobby because I need something that's not tied to my work.
Hi, I'm Kerry Kazmierowicztrimm. I'm a game writer and a musical theater writer. So my background is in acting and in musical theater. I got my MFA in musical theater writing from NYU. I've written a bunch of musicals that they've had about 700 productions in 20 countries. There's one that's been running in Poland for a couple of years. About 3 years ago, I started also working in game writing. I've worked on A Quiet Place, The Road Ahead, which just came out for Saber and Stormind. I worked on Vampire the Masquerade Milan Uprising. I'm doing some localization work for Square Enix through a company called Schlock that works on the Final Fantasy games. I'm writing a new game for Milestone that hasn't been announced yet, and I'm working on a game for a new studio that hasn't been announced yet for a new game that hasn't been announced yet. That is going to be, that is going to be to help people on the autism spectrum like I am. So.
Would your NDA like to meet my NDA?
Yes, please. If we can both, if they can both sign NDAs.
Yeah.
That's what we call a connection in the games industry.
We could call this panel redacted because half of my game writing credits are NDA as well.
Oh yeah, no. My biggest game credit finally expired 3 weeks ago on something I did 3 years ago.
Exactly. Hi everyone, my name's Sam Butin. I am the creative director of a small indie gaming studio in Brooklyn. Focusing on making historical video games. I come from a documentary background. I went to school to make docs, and then fell into the wild world of games like almost a decade ago, which is where all my gray hair comes from. And yeah, I try to bring those like documentary, anthropology is the wrong word, but thinking of traditions of cultures and embedding real primary sources into games, and threading those 2 worlds and communities with my projects.
Cool.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristoph DiMaria. This is Marlo. Marlo, tell them everything. Okay. So I wear many hats. I'm the director of development, musical director, and a co-founder of Will Kemp's Players, which is a local touring Shakespeare company. I am a playwright. I am a poet. I am also a classically trained musician, baritone, guitar. I play a mean melodica. And I also compose and arrange and... I'm a parent, I'm a partner. I did a lot of voiceover work with Velon Studios for their Knockout series, the dodgeball experience. And then I also did a bunch of work for Google, actually like encoding voice to be used for AI. And then lastly, I'm obsessed with the Rusty Lake phone games. Yeah.
Good choice.
Yeah, they're really...
Whoa, new recommendations.
Yeah.
To my ever-growing list.
No.
No. Thanks, Sarah. So I thought I might start just with a question for anybody that wants to dive in and answer. But we talked about when titling this panel, connections between writing, performance, and games. And you all have very interesting, different connections there. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how games fit in with your other forms of artistic practice, and if you kind of started from like a desire to be doing games, or if games is something that kind of came in along with the other pieces, or where do you kind of see the game component in relation to the other creative work you do?
I got into writing through poetry, and then when I told my parents that I was like soft considering going to school for poetry, they were like, "How about a degree that might make you money?" Funny story. I then went to school for journalism, which totally makes me money. But no, so like I'm a Magic the Gathering player, and also was very into JRPGs, so like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy Tactics, and so like writing has always been like a big passion of mine. And you know, when my parents were like, "Hey, if you want to do the whole writing thing, like pick a more practical form," journalism became that entry point, and then after college, journalism is how I got back into gaming because I decided to be a games journalist. I'm allergic to money in a very aggressive manner. And so, yeah, the experiences that I have with gaming tend to be somewhat on the literary side because if the story, I'm not very good at playing games that don't have a story. They're like sometimes food and they're great for like the dopamine drip of doing something different. But I'm usually connected to a well-crafted story. Hence why Final Fantasy Tactics is probably my favorite game of all time.
Good choice.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I adore Final Fantasy Tactics and played many, 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 many hours in my teenage years.
I'm learning the speed run, which is kind of a misnomer because it's a 5-hour speed run.
I mean, very differently, I began, certainly as a video game enthusiast, my dad, at about this age, had popped me in a high chair to play Super Mario Brothers, right when the NES came out. Now I'm dating myself. But, you know, also being allergic to money, I became involved in the theater, particularly Shakespeare, right? It's public domain. You do it in a park. You throw out your hat and you ask for donations. But what got me most, along with RPGs like Final Fantasy, is just immersive storytelling. And I'm actually seeing worlds merging right now. So if we think about, has anybody seen Sleep No More in New York City?
Yeah.
Anybody familiar with this? Right. So it is basically a live-action video game that you are playing.
Yeah.
It's an immersive 5 floors in an old Chelsea hotel in which you are wandering through the story of Macbeth, but there is absolutely no dialogue. There's no text. There's music. There's dance. You can explore everything. You can open every drawer. You can go through secret walls. You can wind up, encountering people you've never met before and being dragged away by an actor. So, what I'm most fascinated about right now is how the storytelling of video games is actually informing theater and how theater has informed video games previously.
Yeah, no, you perfect answer.
Okay. Yeah, and to jump off of that, one of the things that made me excited about getting into game writing, I grew up obsessed with games. I've played Kingdom Hearts like 15 times. But when I was based in LA, I was part of an immersive theater experience called Wicked Lit, where every Halloween season they would do adaptations of literary horror like Edgar Allan Poe, that sort of thing, adapted to be done in an actual mausoleum and graveyard. That made the audiences part of the experience. And then from there, that made me interested in game writing. But after that is when I went to grad school for musical theater writing. And there, what I found really useful that I realized I could then transfer over to game writing is when you're doing musical theater writing rather than playwriting, is you're dealing much more with people in disciplines different than yours, artistic disciplines different than yours, like composers and that sort of thing, and needing to find a way, even though they might have a different vocabulary for how they express their art, find a way to work with them to tell the same story. And I found that was then very useful for trying to get into game writing. So after that, the way I made the transition, I was still writing screenplays at this time. I got hired to rewrite a screenplay for Christian Cantamesa, who worked on like Red Dead Redemption and Shadow of Mordor and those games. And I was like, the big thing that I want out of doing this is if you like my writing, if you can then get me into the game writing space. So I utilized the screenwriting and musical theater writing I did to make a transition into game writing.
Yeah, no, I think that all three of you have answered it. And just to add like a little bit more color to it, I hinted at it in my intro. So my background was going to film school, thinking I was going to make docs, having a panic attack when I graduated and thinking, how the hell is that going to work? And I got very fortunate to get connected with ex-Rockstar developers in New York that were spinning up an independent studio. And I came into that at 22, 23 years old and had a panic attack because I was thinking, I don't know anything about how a game is made. I've played a lot of games, I've seen writer credits in games, but I really don't know the nuts and bolts and the components of how these things are made up. And just to reassure people thinking about these different mediums, like a lot of the skills are applicable. That first game that I worked on, Kerry and I were talking this before, I was doing motion capture, and that's like theater. That's like immersive theater. There's no camera. It's a chair in a room and you're asking an actor to imagine for 15 minutes. So the skill sets that you learn, I think what's important is like creativity is applicable across platforms oftentimes, and I think we have a tendency to silo it. I think a lot about, I'll do a nerdy game reference, but like Sam Lake, the creative director of Remedy Games, who make some of my favorite games, Alan Wake, Control, they use full motion video in a lot of their games. They play with transmedia and these really cool components. And I watched a talk with him once where he talked about how an art form is built on all the other forms that come before it. So for movies, that's like theater and photography and these things like that. So a game can contain any of these other mediums. It doesn't only have to be like a new thing. And I think you can think a lot of times about how to embed your own practices into an interactive experience. And all the examples that everyone's given in the past few minutes are like, are showing the power of that because they're really like form blending and they're not one thing that you can kind of put in a box in that way.
Great answers. Thanks, everybody. I thought, just some of the discussion around collaboration with folks from other backgrounds, other disciplines, and how your own multidisciplinary backgrounds kind of inform your practice might be an interesting one. We started off last year's 1UpState with a panel on creativity and cross-collaboration across different disciplines. So I just wondered if any of you would be up for talking about how you collaborate in the projects you work on with people from other disciplines, like people from different backgrounds than you, and how your own background kind of like informs the way you collaborate with others.
It's hard. It's really hard. Like I think I'm sure most people have had this experience, as all four of us. Like collaboration in general is hard. It's not a unique thing to games. Like creative collaboration, I always joke. For me, I'm a language nerd, so I think a lot about how when you're making a game, or if all of us were to go out and look at the sky, we would all say it's blue, but we would describe it as a different hue of blue. And so much of it is like trying to get on the same page, but also allowing people to have flexibility. And I think the mistakes that I've made or the times where it hasn't worked out is when I've tried to be a control freak about it and dictate the terms of what that sky color looks like and how the constraints of the game works. And I think what I've gotten better at over the course of my career is trying to not be prescriptive with solutions, but be like, these are the problems, I don't know how to answer it. Like, my friend who's the art director, like, you're the art director, you're much better equipped than I am to answer that problem. But as long as you can identify the problems and communicate those with partners, I think then that opens up the door for them to surprise you with their own creativity and add on top of it, which is much better than any drawing I could try to make or thing that I could try to do that would lead that department. So, but yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution for sure.
And to get there, I think that it requires you to have a vulnerability and a willingness, right? You have to go into somebody else's world. I am not a software developer or a game coder by any means, and yet I want to learn a little bit about how that process functions so that I'm informed, when I'm acting as like, how is this going to be used and like in what ways is it going to be processed? And I mean, it's, I think this is ubiquitous to like any creative process. If you're thinking about theater, right, there's a stage manager, there's a lighting designer, there's a set designer, there's wardrobe, there are actors, there's the playwright. All those people have very specialized tasks. They all have to know just enough about each other in order to work together. And you have to let go of ego, certainly, but also of identity. You have to allow your identity to be a little bit fluid as, someone who's working in this format.
Yeah, and what I would say to add to that is I find going in with genuine active curiosity helps a lot, like asking a lot of questions, but not just to have asked questions, but genuinely like, okay, why are you pursuing it this way? What is your intent around that? Which for me, was a big switch from playwriting, because playwriting at the end of the day, like there are other important roles, the director, the actors, the designers, but at the end of the day, like the notion generally is that the playwright is the one that is really deciding the course of the ship because it's being based around the story. But with game writing, something that was useful to me, that was taught to me is, this person compared it to Game of Thrones, and they're like, the narrative writer is never the king or queen. They are, the way to think of them is the hand of the king, the hand of the queen, in that you are there to serve the intentions and desires of the game director and the producers, and you want to serve that intent as well as you can, but the way that you serve that intent is likely to change over and over and over again in game writing. But as long as you're thinking, I am still serving that intention, you can throw a lot away because you have that North Star of what you're actually trying to do.
I think I don't find collaborative work to be very challenging, and I think it's partially because of my background in sports. Like, I grew up playing soccer. I'm a defensive player. I played football. I'm a lineman, and a lot of that is shared work, right? Like, if you're a lineman, you are not the only person blocking for the quarterback. You are one of 4 to 5 other people blocking for the quarterback, and you need to know what to do in your role in any given play. Are you opening a slot for the running back? Are you transitioning to blocking for the tight end making a run? So, like, there's sport ball jargon, right? But so, like, I have a background in something that's very collaborative focus, and then because I now do DEI, a lot of my work and knowledge is based around having to bring sometimes complex or new thought into realms of things that are familiar. So I tend to find collaboration to be like a very easy thing. I agree with a lot of the things that have been said, though, in that genuine curiosity and openness is like the best way. If you come into any collaborative nature as like, I know more than you, or my perspective is the one that we need to focus on now, you're like essentially like putting a hole in the ship before it's even like been put into the water. This is like why your like college group projects tends to fail, because 1 to 2 of you came into it being like, I'm going to be the one to tell us how to do the project. And then usually that creates some passion from somebody in the group. And then you two fight it out on how this like 4-person project gets done. So like going into these spaces being like, hey, I have an idea as to like how this is going to work, but I'm more interested in like knowing what the rest of you want to do is great, because you're letting people know that like I do have ideas, but like right now I'm interested in you as like other people. Tends to like make people very aware that like you are here for the team effort. And so like I think that that's probably like your best opening salvo in those situations, is to like be like, yeah, I got a plan. It doesn't have to be our plan though. So like let's first talk about like what your concerns are for this project, or like, hey, I hear that you're going to be our writer for the game. What direction have you like thought about for like the alternate ending, or like, what do you really need from the music department that you want to get across to them today? Like definitely always starting with what are the other needs and how can they be interconnected?
Yeah. We can do questions now. Yeah.
Sure.
Why wait?
I pushed my way into a question because I had one. So my question is, as a creative, you're more used to, this is my vision and this is what I want, and expressing what you want other people to kind of, whatever you're trying to communicate to other people. As a game developer or somebody working on a game, you're explicitly like inviting people, come and mess with my things, come and interact. How do you balance those two things of like, here's my creative vision and here's how other people are going to kind of F it up on me?
I mean, I think it was kind of touched to a degree from everybody when answering the collaborative answer of like realizing that like you're not the only person anymore. I know for the writers of the group, we're very used to like, we wrote the thing, we know what the thing is supposed to be, do not touch the thing. I grew up hating editors because I was like, you don't know what I'm trying to do here, you peasant, get away. And that obviously wasn't correct, and I've now learned that editors are not the true enemy. sometimes at least. But so like, I think there is probably like a barrier in the beginning for probably some of us. I don't want to like speak for everyone, but I definitely had a bit of control problems of like, well, you asked me to write this script, so why do you need to tell me to do the thing? If you can do the thing, you write the script. And now I'm very much of the, somebody, I don't know everything, and other perspectives are pretty dope and great and meaningful.
Yeah, there's a certain empathy that it sounds like you're describing. And back to your thing about language and the color blue, right? What someone else gets out of reading the work that you're presenting forward is not necessarily anything you've been thinking about.
Yeah.
And one way to break that process, and please tell me if this ever happens in gaming, because I'd be very interested in participating in this kind of writing. But in theater, right, there's devised work. And some of that means that you generate a bunch of content, poetry or lyrics or characters or music, and then you hand it off to somebody else to cut it to shreds, to take their own spin on it, to literally fuck with it, to play with it. And then you get it back and you're like, what is this? And then you go, it's beautiful. And then you get to share it with other people, and you continue through these valence until, a director or, a game developer will eventually put a container around that, right? You can change the form or you can change the content of the thing. If you change both, it gets very messy. But when you have a container for that chaos, you can really discover things that are new.
Yeah, I think there is a parallel for it in games, and for me, it's playtesting, right? It's like when you show. I think I had I'm sure we could all point to numerous examples, but that first game that I mentioned that I worked on for like 2 years, did these crazy cinematics, like poured myself into it, and then I watched someone playtest it for the first time, and they just pressed the triangle button to skip like 2 months of work immediately.
I've never skipped a cutscene in my life.
Roll the tape. But that was a really good lesson for me to learn personally, actually, like relatively early on in my career, which was like, it's a player-driven medium, right? Like there's this handshake agreement. People are going to mess with it, tear it up, do all of these different things. And I think one of the beauties of games is there's no one type of gamer, there's no one type of play style. And I think you have to start to the trick for myself was thinking about it more modularly, like what are the themes and intentions that I want to get through, and if hopefully a player can, without prodding, describe that to me in some way at the end of the playtest, then I've done enough. If they like hit that one adjective or that one word or another tertiary term to that, like that's enough for me. So I think a part of it, what's coming up in our answers too is like it is, as a control freak, a part of it is like being empathetic and giving up that sense of control, but also really leaning into the superpower of a game, which is like play, right? And inviting someone to play. And I think that goes without saying, but sometimes, as someone who comes from a cinematic background and friends that are dipping their toes into this world, I've realized how much of that just comes with like experience and working on these things. And if you haven't had those humbling experiences of watching someone play it entirely different than how you intended, like you haven't learned that you can be much more flexible in those ways, which is exciting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And for me, coming from the musical theater writing background, a lesson from that I carried with me into the game writing that helped a lot was when I was in grad school, there were like 20 composers we had to work with. We worked with a composer per week. We had to write a different song with each of them. When I started working on songs with the different composers, we would get the prompt and I would come in with this like full lyric, the full AABA, the entire thing written already, and then this composer came in with this absolutely gorgeous melody that, conveyed so much of what we needed emotionally to tell the story we were trying to tell. And like my lyric as written didn't work at all, but I was like, based on this music, I know how to adjust what I'm saying to serve the way that you're telling this story. And being open to that was like a, micro version of what macro serves me a lot when it comes to game writing.
I think there's also like this somewhat true but a little bit fantastical view of creatives that we're like all kind of divas and like we're very hard to rein in, but like especially from the backgrounds of what I'm gathering from the people on the panel, a lot of us went to school for our creativity. Mm-hmm. So like whatever sort of diva-ship that we had going in from like, oh yeah, I'm a pretty good poet, and then eventually having to work with editors and be like, oh, I'm a good writer, but I need help more sometimes than not. When you go through the collaborative nature that a lot of schooling in the arts has, a lot of that like inability to work inside rigidity kind of gets lost because like the real world of like creative work is not solo. Like even someone who like writes a novel, right? Like it went through a publishing house and an editor. You don't hand them the manuscript. There's no such thing as like the one true manuscript that gets handed in, and then that becomes the book. I have friends who are published authors. I have not met a single one of them that their manuscript and the final novel is the same. So like there is a lot of this like acceptance, I think, as a creative that like we have a great idea of what we want it to be, but like the excellent version comes from working with other people.
All right.
Question?
You guys have any advice on sort of going into a project, you know, when the gameplay has been developed to a certain extent and you're reverse engineering a narrative with sort of the abstract mechanics that are already in play?
So that's sometimes going to be incredibly difficult because it is hard to prescribe a narrative to something that's already creative. In my personal opinion, like it's very hard for me when I've like done sound design or have been or like to do. I can't even imagine someone like handing me a completed game and being like, "Now tell me what the story of this game is." Like I and maybe because I'm like over harping on like the first question of like how do you collaborate, like I could never picture like a finished product like being like, oh, and now you add the thing to it. Like when I think of music that I've done for games, even when things were in like pre-alpha builds, they're like, here's this level, and you'd be like, oh cool, I'll start designing the music for this level, and then you would see some of the gameplay mechanics and you're like, oh, so like this enemy's rushing, so maybe I want to like have faster pace, maybe I want to pace up the music here. So like maybe my co-panelists are better for this, but like I could never picture like receiving a build and being like, now add the creative thing. Like that, I just like don't know how that would work.
No. Yeah, having had to do some of this, for me, it was, get me a build of the game, let me play the game a lot, and I'll start jotting down my thoughts on how the game makes me feel. Because, like, you want the narrative in some way, most of the time, it can be interesting to, to subvert expectations, to have this tension between the gameplay and the narrative, but generally, you want the narrative to serve the feeling that the gameplay gives you. And so, in that situation, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to play the game for a few days. I'm going to have to write down how I feel about all of this. And then based on those feelings, I will start to jot down like narrative ideas that also conjure that feeling in me. And then we will get on a long call and we will go through all of these ideas and you will tell me which of them are resonating with you. And that's how we started that process.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
I think Kerry, I think you nailed it. Like I've had that experience as well of an NDA project, but working literally like that I can't talk about. But it felt like working with action figures, right? It felt like I was given like toys, and it's like make them talk to each other, and then at the end of the scene, the player character has to go back to his bunker or whatever. Like just find a reason for them to go back to the bunker, and it was really that was like the hardest narrative design job I've ever had because I was left out of the process until that point and thinking about the composition of it. It was an interesting exercise though, and I think the correct answer is, or the way I would think about it is similar to how you described it, which is like a game has a theme and a feeling without narrative. And you could look at board games sometimes, like a good example of that. Like they're simple, but like they're themed, and the theme usually represents like the mechanics, and there's like mechanics, dynamics, aesthetic. There's all that like game terminology, like game nerd stuff that you could go into. But where that comes from, I think, is like it's possible to do it. There's definitely a version of it, but I think the challenge would be not. I think what would be likely to happen in that scenario is you would probably like overload narrative. Like you would almost like the content would be this like dump truck of stuff that's like coming in. So I think the question would be like, how is the work that you're going to do, whether it's like your project that you're working on with friends, like as a storyteller, going to help like inform the design and vice versa? Because like even if they think the design's done, as soon as you add new art or like new line of dialogue, like it's gonna change. You know, like it's gonna open up a whole house of cards, like for things to change too. So
I learned something today, which is great.
No, please, if we have questions, let's.
I had a sort of related question, which is sort of instead of on the gameplay side of things being pre-baked, do you have any advice for those projects where you come on and like there's these pre-baked considerations for the story? So like you come on and they're like, oh, we want this story to have like this and this and this and this character, and like they do this thing, and sort of like managing the tension between you trying to do your job and like you say like serving, collaborating, but also like having these things that you need to hit, I guess.
Yeah, I came onto a project where, you know, I was initially asked to write a narrative Bible based off of this document that was technically 12 pages, but a lot of it was pretty empty. But, like, it had, like, 3 sentences for the world.
Sorry, that's just the most real thing I've ever heard in my life. It's so true. Because even in my DEI work, there are times where I've been handed like their DEI manual, and it's like 24 pages of nothing, and you're like, "Oh, cool! You handed me a blank document. Amazing."
Well, and yeah, to that point, the interesting thing about this is, you know, it had like some names for characters. It had, for some of them, like 1 or 2 sentences where they were from, their nationalities, but very little to go on otherwise. But like it did tell me who the characters had to be, and I had to take those characters and craft a story around like these 20-something characters that they had come up with names and nationalities for. And the interesting thing was as I developed the outline for that, I would sometimes get feedback from someone where it was like, oh, that character would never do that. And I was like, based on what? You gave me a name. So there was, you know, and that's something else I had to learn, like, you come up with something that's specific so that way you can understand what they're specifically thinking. Not because, like, that's what's actually going to end up on the page, but by providing specificity, they will be able to go, oh, I like this, I don't like that, I don't like that. And that's when you start to find the ideas that will actually work with some of what they had in mind that may not actually be on the page.
Yeah, it's usually not like, and so for the projects that I do, I'm gonna more lean on my DEI background of like, I've gotten, you know, their idea of what like a employee handbook should look like, and it's like 24 pages sometimes with nothing. There's maybe like 3 pages of like actual real, like this is stuff an employee handbook should have. And like, to what you were saying, sometimes you just kind of have to go and like do the thing they asked you to do of like, all right, edit it and write and do things, and then you have to have a very real conversation with them, and sometimes they're going to disagree with some of the things that you've added to it, but you're also going to have to be like, hey, so what do you think you handed me in the beginning? Like, what do you think the jumping off point was? And like, one of the things that I will say that if you're gonna do any work in game, whether it be the stuff that we do, coding, whatever, learn how to talk to people. Like learn people who were in my previous panel are nodding their heads because I said, you know, communication skills are great. But like it cannot be understated that like lack of interpersonal communication skills and being able to handle tension. Like, if you're someone who's like, oh, I avoid conflict, like, you can't work in something like games because it's a very heavily collaborative industry, more so than, like, literally any other field I've worked in. And it's, like, near impossible to avoid conflict. And if you're conflict adverse, you just can't have those conversations of, like, hey, you gave me a skeleton. I added muscles, nerves, circulatory system, and skin. And you're telling me that I put the spleen in the wrong place? Well, if you didn't tell me that this wasn't a human, I wouldn't have known not to put the spleen there, right? And so, like, you have to be ready for when they say, oh, well, the spleen's supposed to be in, like, near the sternum. Well, it's like, oh, okay. Please explain to me why the spleen goes in the sternum, right? Like, you have to be ready to have that back and forth conversation. Otherwise, everything's going to fall apart.
Yeah, and as they say in the theater, you have to kill your darlings, which means you have to practice non-attachment to a lot of these things. Now, you know, depending on the way that your company is working, or, you know, your role, or your clout, or, you know, the format of how people treat you, I will say. Like, it's interesting that you work in DEI because you just described, you know, like 24 pages of like virtue signaling, essentially, right? And then you have to have the accountable conversation of like, well, what's essential, and like excise the rest. And in the same way, with any collaborative process, someone could dump a whole bunch of narrative on you, and then you have to ask yourself, well, what is essential to the story? Like, and you have to question the people who gave you that content and make them choose in some ways, right? Because it's very different to have a conversation where you're saying, I wonder if there's a better way to tell this, or I wonder if we can clarify this, as opposed to, that doesn't work, it's too much and it's wrong. So it is a lot about eliciting perspective and just letting go of what you cannot control.
Yeah.
What do you think, Marla?
And to go back to the point of the interpersonal skills, one thing that I would like to say is, as someone on the autism spectrum, like I grew up with a lot of issues with social interactions, so that felt like a big hurdle for me. And I found, you know, for one thing, I got much better with sort of understanding what my blocks were and that sort of stuff. But I've also gotten much better when I join a project of being like, hey, I am on the autism spectrum. Like, these are the ways that, like, I sometimes communicate that may throw people off. Like, if that comes up, let me know. And this is the way of communicating with me that makes it easier for me to understand. And having that conversation early on, rather than, like, when I was younger, I would, like, try to hide it and not be honest about it, has helped a lot with me being able to have those sorts of dynamics and relationships with people.
Yeah, and I know this doesn't really have a whole lot, but I brought this up earlier today in my solo talk. Expressing vulnerability allows people to be vulnerable around you.
Totally.
And so, like, I always bring up that I have, like, an auditory processing problem. So, like, in settings like this, it's usually, like, pretty manageable because there's, like, distance, there's, like, things that, like, I can do. But, like, if I'm having, like, a collaborative meeting and, like, we're sitting and talking, some people will be like, oh, why are you, like, on your phone? I'm like, oh, well, I'm, like, actively looking at the recording apps because, like, seeing the different sound wave, I'm like, oh, this was an important moment, so I'm gonna, like, tag the app because I can't always hear and remember and process. I, like, need sometimes space. And so I've, like, gotten a lot better. In the same way, I used to just be like, nope, I'll just, like, not say anything about it. And then I would, like, misremember things from meetings. And so I had to start being like, hey, I need you guys to talk a little bit slower, or I need you to, like, pause between points, or please try not to talk over each other because then it just becomes white noise to me. And then because I started expressing the needs that I had in meetings, other people were like, oh, well, like, I'm a very slow note taker, so, like, if I also think it would be really helpful if you guys, like, talked a little bit slower so I could take better notes. So, like, even though this has nothing to do with, like, creativity in games, being vulnerable in situations will open up other people to be vulnerable around you, and you'll be able to accommodate each other a lot more.
Great. I feel like we've talked a lot about openness and collaboration in this conversation, and I wonder, just building off of that, if you all have discovered just through your own work any ways or techniques, methods for creating a space where your collaborators and yourself feel more confident being vulnerable, as Amanda was describing. And if we can extend that out also to the player or the audience, right? If we're talking about, say, improvisation forms, like where audience is invited to interact, like how do you kind of allow people to... I tell
really bad dad jokes.
Me too.
I think one of my favorite ways of, like, making new spaces less awkward, especially if I'm working with a new team, whether it's doing a talk, I usually will try to soft open with a bad joke because it helps me gauge where everybody is. If everybody's super engaged and they're, like, chuckling because they're like, oh, wow, that was a really bad dad pun, I'm like, oh, cool. This is, like, a very loosey-goosey type of group of people. I can, like, have a little bit more fun with the way I speak. If you get a bunch of groans and it's like, oh, well, that one failed, but at least they're responding to the joke and they're active listeners. And so I can, like, have active speech patterns, but if there's no response, I'm like, oh, they're not here yet. So, like, I got to figure out how I get them here. And so that's my way of, like, making spaces feel more open and ready for the collaboration, is I, like, try to do some type of social trick to, like, see what the people I'm working with is at. Because, like, if you get no response, then nobody's at the meeting actually yet.
Sure. And I want to bounce back a little bit and argue that there is creative merit to what you're saying. It's not just practical communication skills. You have to give an audience permission to laugh.
Yeah.
You have to give your players permission to have fun with the mechanics of the game that you're bringing and to be invested in the story. You have to invite them. And, so in thinking about that, there is a conference that actually Jamey and I were both part of called the Social Justice Artists Collective, of which video games are represented by you, and we really appreciate that. And that is a space in which a number of artists from a huge range of disciplines get together to specifically focus their work on social justice. And it could be, current events of the day, it could be something that's very personal to them, it could be things that we're observing, in media or in our communities. And, in the same way that you're talking about like how to facilitate that meeting, you have to allow people to participate. You have to allow there to be a little level of discomfort. That quiet before you make the dad pun is okay. It's awkward, and it's okay to be awkward. It's okay to be uncomfortable. And then if you have a facilitator who is, mindful of this, then you can invite people at that point. And then, you get to hear what they care about, and you might find intersection. And that builds solidarity. I mean, it's so funny. We're talking about game development, and so much of it also sounds like community organizing.
Yeah.
Weird.
And that's why I say, like, it's really hard because you can't. I think a lot of times, because, like, a lot of the work we do before we get into these spaces tends to be, like, siloed work, whether it's, like, going to school and getting graded on a project, or, and then also while you're in school, even if you're doing collaborative projects, a lot of your work is your work, right? And so then you get launched into an industry like this, which is, sure, there is a lot of your work, right? Like, everything I do isn't, with someone else. There is a lot of stuff that you do that's siloed. But I would think that most people who work in the games industry would agree that it's, like, very, very collaborative. Because, like, things have to work together. You're not, like, playing Jenga, right? It's more like playing with Kinects or with Legos. And so opening spaces to, like, make people comfortable, like I said, someone had asked, how do I make sure that when I ask people what do they need, that they're going to tell me what they need? And I said, well, you have to tell them what you need first. Because if I say to you, hey, what do you need to get this project done? I'm coming across as either A, your boss, even if I am your boss. And so you might be like, oh no, what if I say something and it's not a need that can be met? Well, then what if they take me off the project, right? So, like, you start thinking about all the reasons why you're not going to share any of your needs, and then your needs don't get met. And so if I say, again, like I keep using auditory processing, if I say, like, hey, when you're talking to me, make sure, like, could you sometimes, like, send me an email afterwards that, like, goes over what we talked about? Because sometimes I'm not able to, like, be present when you're talking to me. And, like, most of my coworkers in different spaces that allowed for that did start to, like, email me after, like, meetings and stuff, like, oh, hey, just so you know, this is what, I wanted to touch on. And then it was much easier for them to say to me X, Y, Z. And so to that question, like, it might be uncomfortable sometimes to say, like, the thing that you're vulnerable about, but, like, just imagine, like, how uncomfortable it is for the person you're working with, and, like, then think about all the times that, like, your needs weren't met, and it, like, made working on that project abysmal. Yeah. And, like, how much you taking that first step will, like, make sure that everybody is more comfortable in that setting.
And if you ever find that it's difficult, remember that the process is designed to create a product that everyone likes and wants to engage with, right? Your coworkers, your collaborators, even your bosses, they're there to support you. And if they're not, well, then maybe, that needs to be examined. And it probably comes out in the product as well. But it's hard to be process-oriented and be focused on the product at the same time, but this is a way to intertwine those worlds and make it work.
Both of your answers are great, because I think about this a lot. Like, I'm too process obsessed. Reed, I'm just, like, neurotic and anxious, so I just think about process a lot. And when I started the studio that it's been running for about a year, and it's just me and 3 other people, at the beginning, I almost made the mistake of spending too much time thinking about process and talking about process, and it took my collaborators being like, can we just, like, start doing the work and stop talking about process, and, like, we'll figure it out while we make it? And I realized, like, a lot of it is almost like games are strange because it's a strange combination of, like, software development and artistic creation. And you hinted at it, Amanda, by saying that there's, like, coordination inside of that. And I think there are a lot of, like, really good tools you don't have to do something like agile or waterfall, or you don't have to do these things that are like prescriptive in one way. But what I like about having a determined process for a team working together is like, it gives you the ability to have retros and talk about things and like evaluate things on an increment. And it means that everyone on the team knows when it's like, that this is like the form and format where we can like be vulnerable and take space and share that. And it doesn't mean that then I'm coming into a meeting on Wednesday at 2:00 and I'm like, what are your biggest fears for this project? And what are your biggest hopes? Like, because I think I have a tendency, like I realized I kind of have ADHD and I just go a ton of different directions really quickly. My communication style doesn't work for all of the way that I would want to be communicated at doesn't work for everyone that I might work with on a project. And I think creating an agreement with all those team members around this is like a core set of beliefs and things, you can distill it into a cultural document. But I think it's also like a process thing. And like anything else, the more times you do it and fail at it, the better you get at it. So it's one of those things that's like, I was kind of afraid to just like start it because I was like, what if we fail? And then I realized we failed like 50 times. We're failing every week when we do it, but it's getting better and easier and quicker, and through that vulnerability and sharing parts of it, like all those things get so much easier over time.
Yep.
So I think it's a great point.
Yeah, well, and to the point of failing, that is something that I take from the theater background. Like when I've worked on developing new shows or working with new theater groups, like one of the things that comes up a lot is like, don't be afraid to fail. Like I've been in a couple theater groups where like when someone does something that fails, like they even celebrate it. Like that's awesome. Like that failure will get us this much closer to the idea that's going to work. And so that's something that I try to bring into the game space in a little way in which I'm doing it, which I have found to be useful recently. Like in the program Miro, I've started to find that like early on, if I just jot down and invite everyone else to jot down like a bunch of ideas in Miro, just little sticky notes of like every good idea, every bad idea, every like idea that someone could build off of, and just have hundreds of ideas and be like, great, now let's go in there and comment on the ones that excite us, that we're really excited about. The focus isn't on like, oh, this doesn't work. The focus is on, ooh, I'm excited by that. I'm excited by that. And that moves you forward in a positive way while like subconsciously acknowledging like, yes, there are a bunch of ideas here that failed, but that's not what we're fixating on.
And I will say, because failure is like a very like important thing for the work that I do, because like sometimes you accidentally use a derogatory term that you didn't realize was derogatory. Failure is like a great thing, and this is a talk that I give a lot of college students, which is fail a lot. You will learn a lot in failure that you don't learn in success. My biggest failure was I had worked really hard from the start of my esports writing career. All I wanted to do was was to cover League of Legends for Riot Games. So all I wanted to do was like my sole focus. Every interview, every article, I would be constantly trying to share it with like people on the esports team at Riot Games. I really wanted that gig. I got an opportunity to be a freelance writer for Riot's EU League. And I let my inability to control my mental health problems to basically piss that opportunity away. So I went from the very, very high of like, oh man, I wrote like this really cool piece for Riot Games, made like the front page of the League of Legends subreddit. I got to write like 5 or 6 more other interviews, and then like I lost that gig in like 3 months because I wasn't taking care of my mental health. And it was like one of the most like painful days of my life because I got there, right? Like I got to do the thing that I had put 4 years of work into, and I had never really been forced to face my mental health problems. And that moment I was like, oh, you can't do work and have mental health problems at the same time. Like eventually the house of cards will fall apart. And nothing made me tackle my mental health better than failing at working for Riot Games. And it's like, even now, it's like a very challenging thing to share because like that was the thing I'd like spent a lot of time working towards. But like I now have a therapist, I have a psychiatrist, I'm on like a medication regimen. I know the signs of burnout and when I need to like take a break. I know what to do when I'm starting to feel burned out and I didn't realize it right away. I have all of these systems in my life that I didn't have back in 2018, 2017, that like only exists because I failed real hard. And like, it sucks, but like failure is important in your growth experience. And so like if there's anything you learned today, it's like, one, collaborative skills are really important, and two, failing is like pretty great and can be really amazing at times.
And three, a culture needs to be built around that supports you. I love how much personal responsibility you've taken from that failure and how you're learning, Amanda. Thanks for sharing that story. At the same time, right, you also need to be working for people who share that value.
Yeah.
And not just for themselves, but to support you in that.
Yeah.
Want to open it up? I don't know how we're doing on time.
Yellow.
All right. But, oh yeah. Yeah. Anybody have a question that you haven't shared yet? Want to invite you? That's your opportunity.
Sure.
Has there ever been a narrative decision that you've made that married itself to the gameplay really well?
Well, there are two narrative writers here, kind of.
Narrative decision that I made.
I mean, I think there are moments on every game where you have like yes would probably be like it's euphoric when you have that moment, right? That's like things start coming together, and mapping theme and mechanics and story and all of these things in more than one way, and a player can describe it to you in the terms that I was mentioning before, similar to your. So I don't think it's. Hopefully we haven't painted such a dire picture that that's like not ever the case, or that's like a rarity, because I think that has to happen, right? Like this is a creative medium. Like you have to be hopeful. You have to, especially like, and I think for all four of us is like, especially in leadership, you have to be like Thomas the Tank Engine. Like I think we can. You have to like hold the hope, or else like if you don't, who will, right? So I think it's different on each project, and I think one of the funny things is as the further you get from it, like the first game I worked on, I used to know the whole script to the game by heart, like 3 hours of cutscenes, like everything by heart, and I was like, there's 10% of my brain that's just stuck on that. I'm never gonna have that back. And I had the experience like 6 months ago of watching someone play it, and I realized I didn't remember like anything. It was as if I had amnesia and I was watching something from 8 years ago in my life. So I think things feel very full when you're living it, but it's also like, to Amanda's point, a career is a really long thing, and I think it's really healthy to have periods that are intense and then these periods that it goes down a little bit, and you think about those two polarities. I think about that a lot because like so much of making a game is just like the making the game part of it. That's 99%, right? Like the coming out of it is great and awesome, and then it's like next game, like here we go, like back into the trenches. And if that part's not enjoyable, and if you don't figure out a way that that's generative and fun, then that's really tough. Like I've seen people sometimes that only enjoy that release part of it, and I think that's where a lot of like the agony and the ecstasy of game development comes from, because you have the honest truth is, as a game developer, you have like very little control over what happens in that stage.
I was actually about to say that, like, to that question, it's hard because you're never, to like, I think you said it earlier that there's like so many different types of people that play games. You're never gonna know the thing that you did in the game that like had a connection point with someone, because you're not going to meet every gamer. Right, like I've helped with music on games, and I've helped with like DEI decisions on games, and I have no idea if anyone cared. There's probably somebody out there that cared very greatly, and there's also probably people that went, cool, this slot goes here, awesome, right? And I'll never know the peaks and valleys. I'll never know if like a change that I made to like the character creator was like super impactful to somebody and feeling seen, because sometimes people like that just don't share that opinion, and also even if they did and they shared it on like Twitter or something, the likelihood that I see it, right, is like untold. And so like there's probably something I've done in the game that's like been something that's super big to this person, but like no idea.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And for me, the most positive experience I've had with that was when narrative got to be a heavy part of the pre-production phase. Like I've had experiences where narrative hasn't really come in a big way until production, until things are already in motion. When it was in the pre-production phase, it allowed for me to like be told about gameplay mechanics and be like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we used this gameplay mechanic as an actual story point? And then I built some ideas around that. And then the ideas, the the people developing the gameplay were like, oh, based off of this narrative idea, we've actually come up with another gameplay idea. And because, that could happen in the production phase, but because it was pre-production, it wasn't like, well, us trying to incorporate that would, would push us back all of this. And, it didn't cause concerns in terms of a ripple effect as much as it was like, oh, because we have the time, we can implement this from the outset. So that was the most positive experience I've had with developing narrative with gameplay.
Great. I think we should call it there. Want to thank all of our panelists one more time, and thank you all for coming. And thanks for coming to 1UpState. I hope you'll have a lovely evening.
The star.
And thanks to you, Jamey, for moderating.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Woo!